The Redmond estate rose against the gray skies of early 17th century England like a fortress dressed in elegance, its stone walls polished by the wealth of generations, and its gardens kept with a precision that suggested not care, but control. Travelers spoke of its grandeur, of carriages arriving from London, of guests tied to the court of King James I, yet beneath the surface, those who worked within the manor whispered of something unspeakable. The Redmond line was rich, its influence tied to whispered alliances with nobles and men of learning. But its future had always been marked by silence. For though heirs were born, they did not live. It began with a child who failed to rise from his bed after a week of sudden fever. Then another, who slipped beneath the waters of the manor pond, though he had never wandered so far alone. A daughter followed, pale and breathless, her body claimed by what was called a chill, though servants swore the girl's chamber was as warm as the hearth. Physicians were summoned, records were signed, and each time the explanation was simple, almost comforting in its ordinariness. Fevers came to noble children, accidents befell them, weak constitutions ran in certain bloodlines, yet every death, however different in appearance, carried with it the same outcome. The estate's vast holdings fell back into the hands of the patriarch, always preserved by tragedy. In the portrait gallery, the truth hung silently. Rows of canvases depicted children who never aged, frozen in oil paint with soft cheeks and pale eyes. Their expressions carried the innocence of those who had never learned to betray. But within the stillness of those paintings, something darker seemed to hide. Visitors who passed through the corridor spoke of a sensation that the painted eyes followed them, as though the children wished to speak, yet their mouths had been sealed in silence. And always the gallery ended with a single adult figure, the patriarch, painted not in youth but in full maturity, his gaze heavy, his hands resting upon the arms of a carved chair. He was the one constant in a hall filled with ghosts that never lived to see inheritance. The villagers who lived near the estate knew not to speak openly, yet the rhythm of the tragedies did not escape them. Every time a death was recorded, a rumor of fortune followed. The Redmonds secured new lands, a new alliance, or greater favor from court. The timing was too precise, too beneficial, and yet nothing was ever proven. Some whispered of a curse laid upon the family, others of a debt to forces darker than the king's blessing. But within the manor the staff carried on with bowed heads, scrubbing the floors where small footsteps no longer echoed, cooking meals for chambers that no longer required them, lowering their eyes when the patriarch passed as though they feared their thoughts could be read. At night, the manor did not rest. Servants reported faint sounds from sealed rooms, whispers carried down the stone halls, and once a nursemaid swore she heard the desperate tapping of small fingers against the locked door of a disused nursery. But when she spoke of it, her words were dismissed as grief and imagination. In a place where silence served the master, no cry was ever allowed to disturb the order. The Redmond wealth endured untouched, while the lives meant to inherit it withered away one by one, always explained by nature, never by design. Yet behind the careful records and whispered condolences there was a pattern too neat to be chance. Every death followed not chaos but order. Every tragedy came not in the wildness of the world but within the stillness of the estate itself, and in that stillness lay a hidden hand, guiding the family's history toward an inheritance that would never be claimed. It was not curse nor chance, but something colder, methodical, and deliberate. The Redmond legacy began here, in the quiet elimination of children who never grew, heirs who never inherited, and a patriarch who always remained. And though the world outside saw only the grandeur of the estate, inside its walls lingered a truth no one dared name. That wealth and silence were bought at the cost of young breath, stolen before it could ever rise. Dr. Elias Redmond stood as both savior and sentinel of his family's name. To the world beyond the manor, he was a man of refinement and intellect, a physician of rare skill whose counsel had been welcomed at Queen Anne of Denmark's court, a healer trusted among nobles who spoke his name with respect. He cultivated the image carefully, a scholar with ink-stained fingers, a servant of learning with shelves lined in tomes of alchemy, spiritual philosophy, and the newly emerging sciences. His home was littered with the relics of discovery, glass vessels imported from Venice, manuscripts copied at great cost from the universities of Padua and Leiden, even fragments of ancient texts bound in cracked leather that whispered of secret arts long suppressed by the church. To those who saw only his outward life, Elias was a man pursuing truth in an age of superstition. Yet in the silent corridors of the Redmond estate, where heirs vanished before their time, his brilliance revealed its darker shape. In the locked study where servants dared not linger, Elias kept his true journals. They bore not the records of healing, but of possession. Children were written not as sons and daughters, but as vessels, their names stripped into initials, their fates reduced to outcomes in the margins of pages. He measured not growth or health, but thresholds. How much mercury vapor could a child breathe before the lungs betrayed them? How long could the body fight an engineered fever before collapse? How many leeches placed in carved patterns along the veins could drain blood without instant death? Each entry was clinical, detached, and disturbingly calm. Words that spoke of a child's final gasps were delivered with the same tone as a scholar noting the weather. Failure was written as trial incomplete. Death became termination. There was no grief, only adjustment for the next experiment. The methods were not the brutal chaos of a murderer, but the deliberate cruelty of a scientist twisting knowledge into ritual. Mercury, praised by alchemists as a liquid of transformation, became Elias's favorite instrument. He would heat the metal in bowls until vapors shimmered like a ghost above the surface, then release it into chambers where children were left to breathe. The vapor did not kill at once, but in waves. The lungs tightened, the throat burned, and fever spread like fire under the skin. To Elias, each stage was a revelation. He wrote of the way eyes dulled before the heart slowed, as if recording the decay of a specimen instead of a child who once laughed within those halls. Other trials followed the obsession with air itself. Elias designed sealed chambers, small enough to hold a frail body where vents could be opened or closed at his will. Sometimes he allowed a thin stream of oxygen, just enough to stretch suffering into hours. Other times he cut air entirely, timing how long silence could hold before death claimed its final right. He called these experiments the study of breaths, writing with fascination about the threshold between life's last inhale and the body's collapse into stillness. What others would have seen as horror, he catalogued as discovery, convinced he was unraveling the mysteries of soul and flesh. Blood was his other obsession. Inspired by both ancient humoral theories and whispers of transmutation, Elias drained his victims in precise patterns. He placed leeches not randomly but in deliberate lines carved into the flesh, believing that the order of the wounds mirrored cosmic design. He watched as children paled, their veins collapsing under the weight of orchestrated loss, their bodies trembling as the leeches pulled life away in steady rhythm. He recorded pulse rates, the shifting of lips from color to ash, even the silence that followed, as though silence itself were a measurable element. For him, these were not deaths, but necessary data in a grand design. Behind his mask of civility, Elias convinced himself he was no monster, but a keeper of knowledge hidden from the ignorant. The heirs he destroyed were not seen as blood and bone, but as trials leading toward perfection. Each small coffin lowered into the earth outside the manor represented not tragedy but progress. Another step closer to a truth only he was capable of grasping. And the world, blind to the reality within his walls, continued to honor him. Nobles sought his advice, physicians admired his collections, and neighbors whispered of his brilliance even as children around him disappeared one by one. The shadow he cast was not born of madness alone, but of method, the careful balance between innocence in public and cruelty in private. Elias Redmond lived as two men in one body, a physician celebrated as a man of science, and a hidden architect of ritualized suffering. The heirs he consumed were the currency with which he paid for his legacy. And though the world saw only tragedy, his journals revealed the truth. In his own words, the Redmond curse was no curse at all. It was design. And so the silence within the estate deepened, each death another line in his private scripture, each absence another notch in his methodical pursuit. What appeared to be misfortune to the outside world was, within those locked chambers, the deliberate crafting of a history where inheritance would never pass, only return to the one who orchestrated it all. At the far end of the Redmond estate, beyond a corridor, few servants were allowed to enter. There stood a door of blackened oak reinforced with iron. It bore no handle, only a hidden latch that Elias Redmond alone controlled. Behind it lay a room that was neither bedroom nor study, but something carefully designed, something he called in his journals the Chamber of Breaths. He had modeled it after anatomical theaters he had visited in London, where physicians displayed dissections to gathered scholars, but here there were no audiences, no witnesses, only Elias and the helpless bodies of heirs entrusted to his care. The room was sealed stone, with vents built into the walls, hidden behind carved wooden panels. With a twist of a lever or the slide of a panel, Elias could shift the air itself, controlling who breathed and who did not. To the household, he described the chamber as a place of healing. He spoke of vapors that could ease coughs, of sweetened airs laced with herbs to strengthen weak lungs, of controlled climates that might protect delicate children from the damp chill of English winters. And so, heirs were brought into the chamber without resistance, led by hands that believed they were guiding them toward recovery. But once the heavy door was closed and the latch sealed, the chamber ceased to be a sanctuary. It became a slow grave, a theater of suffocation where the very air was twisted into an instrument of ritual. Elias did not smother his victims with brute force. That would have been too clumsy, too immediate. Instead, he believed true knowledge lay in the edge between life and death, in the lingering interval where breath still fought to exist but was denied its fullness. He would light bowls of herbs, rosemary, sage, juniper, then add substances hidden from common knowledge. Mercury was sometimes vaporized, its poison sweet and invisible. At other times he burned resinous woods that blistered the lungs, filling them with smoke that both soothed and destroyed. Children inhaled, believing they were being healed, their bodies weakening slowly until coughing became silence, and silence became stillness. The chamber was not only physical but psychological. Elias constructed it to play upon the senses. Vents opened and closed at his will, making sudden drafts whisper like unseen hands brushing across the skin. Mirrors placed at angles reflected light in distorted ways, causing young eyes to see shifting shadows where none existed. To frightened children, the room seemed alive, haunted, filled with presences just beyond sight. Some cried for help, others prayed, but their voices were absorbed by the sealed walls, heard only by Elias, who stood calmly taking notes as he watched the struggle unfold. He called these illusions necessary, for they heightened fear, and fear, he believed, revealed the purest form of breath. Each experiment was measured with cold precision. He timed the moments from first distress to last gasp, noting how the body convulsed, how lips darkened, how fingernails scratched at the wooden floor in a useless fight for survival. Sometimes he introduced opium smoke, letting the children slip into a daze before the air thinned, so that their deaths came not in violent panic but in a soft collapse, their minds lured into silence before the lungs ceased their work. Other times he withheld all comfort, letting the full weight of suffocation drive them into wild terror, believing the raw fear etched deeper marks upon the soul. To Elias, both outcomes were valuable. Each death was a page in his hidden scripture. What haunted the few who suspected but never spoke was the aftermath. Children carried into the chamber were often found lifeless hours later, their skins strangely pale, their mouths stained faintly with ash or resin, their small chests marked by the shallow indentations of struggle. To grieving families and household staff, Elias explained it all away. He spoke of weak constitutions, of inherited fevers, of sudden turns in delicate health. His calmness in grief was taken as strength. His reputation as a physician shielded him from suspicion. Those who whispered of something unnatural found their voices silenced quickly. For who could accuse a man so respected, a man welcomed in the presence of queens? Yet within Elias himself the chamber bred a deeper transformation. He began to see air not as life's gift, but as a substance to be mastered, a divine element to be withheld or given, like a god choosing who may live and who must die. His journals grew more ritualistic, filled with sketches of lungs drawn like vessels, diagrams of vents as though they were sacred architecture, and passages describing the purity of silence that followed each experiment. He no longer saw children as heirs, but as offerings, vessels emptied of breath in order to reveal truths the living world refused to give. And so the Chamber of Breaths became the unseen heart of the Redmond curse, a place where air itself was twisted into a tool of cruelty. Each death within those walls was methodical, devastating, and invisible to the outside world. While society heard only of frailty and misfortune, within the sealed chamber Elias Redmond shaped, silence into a weapon, refining his art of controlled suffocation with each passing air. It was not sickness that consumed the Redmond children, nor chance nor curse, but the deliberate hand of a man who believed that by stealing breath, he could unlock the secrets of life itself. Elias Redmond understood that suffering left traces, and though he recorded each detail in his private journals, he feared the world might one day stumble upon the raw truth of what had taken place inside the chamber of breaths. To cloak the horror, he began crafting scenes of innocence, disguising ritual as tragedy and violence as purity. When a child's body lay still, he did not permit it to be buried in the state in which it was found. Instead, he washed the limbs with his own hands, dressed the small form in white linen gowns, and combed hair as though preparing for a holy ceremony. He placed the children before tall mirrors, polished until they shone with unnatural clarity, and seated them upright in ornate chairs as if they had simply drifted into sleep. The mirrors were not for vanity but for capture. Elias believed that a soul at the moment of its final breath left a trace that could be bound in reflection. To him, each glass pane was a prison of the spirit, an unseen record of the death he had orchestrated. He arranged the bodies with hands folded, heads tilted slightly toward the reflective surface, and candles placed carefully to illuminate the face so that the last impression seared into the mirror would not fade. In his writings, he spoke of the mirrors as vessels that held what flesh had lost. He was not only killing, he was collecting. Visitors who glimpsed these displays were unsettled, though none dared voice accusation. A guest might enter a chamber expecting to find grief, but instead encounter a silent tableau. A pale child in white seated before a mirror, lips parted as though whispering to their own reflection. Many left shaken, whispering later that they had seen not a corpse but an angel, preserved in purity, touched by God in some mysterious way. Servants who carried trays past such rooms felt their stomachs twist but silenced themselves for fear of losing position or worse. And when questions arose, Elias spoke softly of divine mysteries, of how some children are called early to heaven, their faces still glowing with innocence, their reflections lingering as blessings. In truth, he was refining ritual. The mirror became as essential as mercury or opium, for he believed the reflection sealed his work in permanence. He documented which poses produced the most convincing illusions, which angles of light gave the sense of peace rather than struggle, which garments most resembled purity untouched by earthly suffering. When one child died convulsing in the chamber, Elias waited until the limbs stiffened, then forced the body into a position of serenity, propping the chin so that the death mask appeared calm. To outsiders it was tragedy, softened by grace. To Elias it was control even beyond death. This method became pattern. Each heir's death, however violent in secret, was followed by a ritual of white gowns, combed hair, and mirrored reflection. He delighted in the perfection of order, convinced that repetition gave him mastery not only over the body but over the soul. The manor, once heavy with whispers of illness, soon carried a new reputation among those outside its walls. Rumors spread that the Redmond home was blessed, that children within its halls passed not in agony but in angelic sleep, leaving behind mirrored signs of God's touch. Pilgrims and superstitious villagers murmured that the estate had become a place where heaven reached down to claim the innocent. None suspected that the angelic faces had been crafted by hands that caused the suffering in the first place. Yet even as he concealed his acts in ritual, Elias himself began to change. He spent long hours alone with the mirrors, staring into them as though waiting for the trapped souls to speak. Some nights he claimed to see a flicker in the glass, a distortion of breath, a faint outline of the child that once lived. He wrote of these visions as confirmation, convinced that his ritual had worked, that he had bound purity to the mirror's depth. His obsession with reflection deepened into belief, and belief into need. The more he saw in the glass, the more he desired to add to it. Servants learned to avoid the rooms where the mirrors stood. Even after bodies were buried, Elias left the glass untouched, never covered, never moved. He said to do so would release what was captured. Over time, the estate filled with these silent witnesses. Rows of mirrors that never lost their polish, each one tied to a death disguised as innocence. Guests described walking through halls where their own reflections appeared crowded, as though other faces stared back from behind the surface, faint, pale, unblinking. Few returned more than once, and still, suspicion never rose. The pattern was too neat, too artfully concealed beneath the appearance of frailty and divine calling. No one dared accuse a physician praised in courts. No one risked suggesting that angelic death might in truth be murder. And Elias, moving always with calmness and dignity, perfected his concealment. Death had become not only method but display, a tableau of purity that convinced the world of blessing while hiding the hand that orchestrated suffering. The mirrors stood as his gallery, each pane a prison of silence, each reflection a record of torment polished into seeming grace. What the world saw as angelic was, in truth, the work of a mind that found beauty in control, purity in suffering, and permanence in the stillness of reflection. The Redmond curse continued, child after child, each one arranged before the mirror as though asleep, each one bound to the ritual Elias called innocence. As the years deepened and the chamber of breaths filled with silence, Elias Redmond's obsession sought new form. He had studied suffocation, charted fevers, and perfected the arrangement of angelic death. But he craved permanence. Mirrors, however convincing, reflected only a shadow of what had been taken. Flesh rotted, bones crumbled, and even innocence posed in white linen decayed until all that was left was memory. Elias wanted more than memory. He wanted preservation, something that would not fade with time. His mind, restless and hungry, turned toward the continental fascination with wax. He had read of men like Gaetano Zumbo in Italy, whose models of plague-ravaged bodies were displayed to horrified scholars, their waxen figures capturing disease in uncanny stillness. To others it was art in service of anatomy. To Elias it was inspiration. If wax could eternalize corruption and decay, then surely it could eternalize innocence, suffering, and death itself. The first attempt was simple, almost crude. A child lay weak from opium fumes, lungs struggling in shallow gasps. Elias heated beeswax in an iron cauldron, mixing in white pigments to resemble pale flesh. With steady hands, he poured the molten liquid over the child's arm, watching the skin blister and peel beneath. The screams were muffled, then broken into choking gasps, until silence overtook them. When the wax cooled, it formed a hardened shell, sealing the limb as though frozen mid-breath. The body did not survive the trial, but Elias noted with fascination how the wax captured every contour, every vein, every detail of skin that moments before had been alive. He wrote in his journal not of failure, but of breakthrough. With each new trial, his methods grew darker, more elaborate. Some victims were already near death when the wax touched their flesh, their skin collapsing into burns as the liquid coated them in layers. Others he chose deliberately strong so that the body could endure longer. He bound their limbs to wooden frames, forcing them upright as he ladled wax over their faces, the heat sealing eyelids shut, mouths frozen open in half screams that were then captured forever in hardened form. Some suffocated beneath the wax, lungs pressing desperately against airways sealed tight, their panic immortalized in the stiff shine of the mask. Others survived long enough to bear multiple layers, their flesh beneath blistering, cracking, and fusing into the grotesque effigies Elias so cherished. The more grotesque the form, the more Elias believed it held truth. Smooth faces he dismissed as false. What he desired were imperfections, the half-melted features, the warped and twisted expressions, the bodies that seemed caught between life and death. To him, this was purity stripped bare. He convinced himself that through these figures he was not only preserving heirs but capturing the essence of their struggle, the exact moment where soul slipped free of body. These effigies were not art to be displayed in parlors or studies. They were his private scripture, locked away in the crypt beneath the manor. Down in those stone chambers, row upon row of waxen children stared back from the shadows. Some sat upright, their faces melted into half-human grotesqueries. Others lay as though in sleep, their waxy forms twisted by burns and fissures that revealed glimpses of ruined skin beneath. Each bore a plaque, not with a name but with a mark, a number in sequence, as though part of an ongoing experiment catalogued for eternity. Servants who carried torches into the crypt spoke of the smell, a mingling of candle wax, scorched flesh, and damp stone, and begged to never descend again. Those who disobeyed Elias's command to stay away vanished swiftly, their absence explained as dismissal or departure. No one questioned further. Above ground, the estate grew heavier with rumor. Neighbors noticed the way hearses left the manor with unsettling frequency, carrying coffins small and unadorned. Whispers spoke of a curse that no Redmond heir could escape. Yet those who visited within were sometimes shown only the mirrors, the angelic tableau Elias arranged, and left believing they had seen tragedy softened by divine hand. No one suspected that beneath their feet in the silence of the crypt, waxen children stood in eternal witness to what had been done. For Elias himself, the crypt was not horror but triumph. He walked among his effigies with reverence, fingertips grazing the hardened wax as though greeting familiar companions. He spoke to them in thought, if not in voice, believing their souls lingered within, trapped not in glass this time but in hardened shell. His journals grew fevered with language no longer scientific but ritualistic. He described the wax as a vessel for breath, the burn as purification, the deformities as truth etched upon eternity. To him, the heirs had not been erased but perfected, remade into forms that would never wither, never escape him, never betray his pursuit of knowledge. But beneath the triumph, there was something else, a slow collapse of his own mind. The more he worked, the less distinction he saw between life and effigy. At times he claimed the waxen figures moved in the candlelight, their half-frozen faces shifting with faint recognition. Other times he swore he could hear the sound of shallow breathing echo from their stiffened mouths, as though the last gasps he had stolen had not fully escaped. What would have been madness to others was to Elias confirmation. The waxen trials were not failure nor grotesque horror, but proof that he had found the boundary between flesh and eternity and mastered it. And so the crypt of the Redmond estate filled air by air, body by body, until the true legacy of the family was not written in portraits or property, but in the hidden gallery of waxen children, each one a monument to suffering shaped into permanence. To the world, the Redmonds remained cursed. To Elias, they were perfected. By the time the crypt beneath the Redmond estate brimmed with waxen effigies, Elias Redmond's hunger had already shifted towards something darker, something even he whispered of only in his private writings. Death alone was no longer enough. Preservation no longer satisfied. He now sought transformation, a belief born from fragments of legend and whispers of forbidden science. In his journals, he wrote of Elizabeth Bathory bathing in the blood of virgins, of alchemists who claimed that metals could be purified into gold, and of scholars who suggested that blood was more than fluid, that it carried within it the essence of lineage, purity, and divine spark. If wax could trap the form, then blood, he reasoned, might preserve the soul's vitality. It became his new obsession, the alchemy of bloodlines. Elias convinced himself that noble blood refined through suffering contained a secret elixir. If harvested with precision and sealed in sacred vessels, it might yield longevity, perhaps even immortality. No longer content with suffocation or burning alone, he began draining heirs not as a means of ending life, but as a ritual to distill their essence. The children brought into his care were strapped to carved oak chairs, their veins traced carefully with chalk before incisions were made. He did not cut recklessly. Each wound was planned with geometric precision, often in patterns resembling stars or circles, as though drawing symbols upon living flesh. From these wounds, blood trickled into channels he had carved into the wood itself, flowing downward into waiting crystal goblets. These vessels, cut from Venetian glass and shaped into chalices of grotesque beauty, were displayed openly in his study. To unsuspecting guests, he presented them as wine cups, symbols of refinement. But when the doors closed and the candles were lit, Elias studied them with the intensity of a man gazing upon scripture. He watched the blood clot and separate, the way it thickened or thinned depending on the victim's age, the way its color shifted under flame. Sometimes he placed the goblets near frost until the blood crystallized into dark shards. At other times he let it ferment in sealed flasks, inhaling the stench as though it were incense from a holy altar. Each experiment was recorded with the same detached reverence that had marked his earlier work. But now his words carried the weight of ritual, the language of a man who no longer thought of himself as physician, but as priest of suffering. The deaths that followed were slow and devastating. Some children bled for hours, their skin paling as life slipped away drop by drop, their cries growing weaker until they fell into silence, eyes glazed and lips trembling with their final gasps. Elias did not rush the process. He believed the longer the suffering, the more potent the essence collected. Others perished more swiftly when he miscalculated, their blood pooling too quickly, their lives extinguished before His ritual was complete. These he considered failures, wasted vessels unworthy of preservation. He adjusted his incisions, refined his patterns, and began again. To him, every mistake was only another step toward perfection. Within the manor, the silence deepened. Servants whispered of rooms that reeked of iron and candle smoke, of strange stains upon the oak floors scrubbed until the grain itself darkened. They spoke of Elias's growing reclusion, of nights when the study glowed with candlelight until dawn, the shadows of chalices flickering across the walls. To outsiders, the Redmonds were still cursed by misfortune, their lineage mysteriously childless. But within, the curse had become ritual, each death part of a greater design that only Elias could comprehend. What unsettled even the most loyal of staff was the way Elias treated the chalices after each ritual. He would raise them to the light, tilting them as though in a toast, his lips murmuring silent blessings to the contents within. Some nights he pressed the rim against his mouth, allowing the thickened blood to touch his tongue. He described in his journals the taste of lineage, the weight of ancestry upon his palate, the conviction that he was consuming not just liquid but inheritance itself. He believed that through these acts he was merging with the Redmond bloodline, becoming its eternal keeper, never subject to the weakness of heirs who withered too soon. By now the legacy of the family had taken on a different life in the whispers beyond the estate walls. Neighbors no longer spoke of fortune or favor, but of a line that seemed cursed, always rich yet strangely empty of laughter. No heirs grew to inherit, no children played in the gardens. The wealth remained, but the future vanished. People called it misfortune or divine punishment, but the truth lay hidden in crystal goblets flickering under candlelight. Vessels filled not with wine, but with the harvested essence of lives stolen, drained with deliberate cruelty, and preserved in the belief that suffering could be transmuted into eternity. By the late years of King James's reign and the slow rise of Charles to prominence, the Redmond estate had gained a reputation not only for wealth, but for strangeness. The family line seemed cursed with silence, yet the patriarch thrived, his fortune undiminished, his estate curiously untouched by the ruin that plagued many houses in those unsettled years. Whispers of divine favor mixed uneasily with talk of divine punishment. But still nobles and envoys visited, curious about the man who walked so close to ruin yet never fell. Elias Redmond welcomed them with practiced grace, his demeanor calm, his voice measured, his reputation as a physician securing him the respect of all who crossed his threshold. Yet their presence threatened his hidden order, for every guest risked stumbling upon fragments of the horrors he could not fully conceal. A cousin tied by blood to Charles I arrived first, a man who expected laughter in gardens and young heirs at play. Instead, he found only silence and rooms heavy with mirrors. He remarked aloud that the estate seemed like a tomb disguised as a manor, and though Elias smiled politely, he noted the words with quiet calculation. Soon after, a French envoy passed through carrying whispers of new science and the court intrigues of Paris. He was disturbed by the stillness of the household, unsettled by the absence of children's voices, and later told his companions that he had never seen a home of such wealth so utterly devoid of life. Elias assured him that illness had robbed the estate of joy, that misfortune had carved the silence, and the envoy, though unconvinced, left with unease clinging to his mind. But not all visitors left with vague impressions. A noblewoman traveling through the county insisted on staying within the estate during a storm. She swore later that in the dead of night she saw a small figure standing at the end of the corridor, its body motionless, its face obscured. When she stepped closer, she saw that the mouth was sealed tight, not with cloth but with wax, hardened into a grotesque mask. The figure vanished into shadow before she could scream, and when she told Elias the next morning, he laughed gently, suggesting that rain and candlelight had played tricks on her weary mind. Still, she left quickly, refusing to return. Another guest noticed subtler things. A mirror fogged with condensation, though no one had exhaled before it. The faint scent of burnt herbs in a room where no fire had been lit. A chair pulled close to a mirror as if someone had been seated before it in ritual silence. These details unsettled him enough to whisper later of witchcraft, though not in open accusation. Elias dismissed these suspicions with practiced calm, calling them hysteria, tricks of imagination, the fancies of travelers far from home. But he knew such whispers could not be allowed to grow. His reputation was his shield, and even the smallest crack could shatter it. So Elias began to silence outsiders with the same cold method he had used on Heirs. Guests who looked too closely were invited to stay the night, lodged in chambers already prepared for quiet death. There, smoke from burning herbs seeped through hidden vents, lulling the sleeper into stillness before tightening their throats. Some awoke coughing and clawing at the air, only to collapse before they could cry out. Others slipped quietly into darkness, their breath stolen as if by dream. At dawn, their bodies were carried away, not to the manor crypt, but to marshes and roadside ditches where death could be blamed on misfortune. Drowning, chills, fevers, explanations were easy, and no one suspected the estate itself. Travelers vanished. Carriages left lighter than they had arrived. Rumors spread of accidents along the roads leading away from the Redmond lands, but Elias's hands remained unstained in the eyes of society. To those beyond his walls, he was still the physician, still the scholar, still the grieving patriarch whose children had never survived to inherit. No one imagined that he extended his cruelty even to those who crossed his threshold as guests, suffocating them in beds designed for hospitality, then discarding their corpses as though they were experiments gone wrong. Each death was noted in his journals with the same detachment as before. He recorded the time it took for the smoke to overwhelm the body's convulsions, the stillness of lips as life ebbed away. Guests became data, outsiders transformed into trials, their suffering feeding his belief that he was perfecting not murder but ritual. He saw himself not as killer but as custodian of knowledge too great for others to comprehend. In his mind, silencing them was mercy, preventing ignorance from corrupting the truth he alone could grasp. The estate's silence deepened. Those who returned from visits carried unease they could not explain, as though the manor itself pressed upon the lungs and whispered of death. Others never returned at all, their fates buried under explanations of accident or travel misfortune. Yet through it all, Elias endured untouched, his calm demeanor unbroken. He stood as both host and executioner, physician and tormentor, manipulating breath, blood, and reflection not only within his family but upon those who dared enter his domain. And thus the Redmond estate became known not only for heirs who never grew, but for guests who never returned. rumors swelled like shadows across the countryside. And though none dared speak accusation, all agreed that something unnatural lingered within those walls, something tied not to misfortune, but to method. By the time Elias Redmond reached the height of his influence, the line between healer and tormentor had dissolved completely. His journals no longer resembled the writings of a physician. They had become scripture, filled with symbols, patterns, and invocations of suffering, as though pain itself were divine language. What once began as scattered trials and secret deaths now swelled into a grand orchestration. He called it the harvest, a ritual designed not for one victim but for many, a symphony of silence where multiple heirs would perish together under different hands of his design. It was not enough to kill in solitude anymore. Elias longed to compare, to measure, to place death side by side and watch its variations unfold like instruments in harmony. The estate was prepared for the ritual as though for ceremony. Chambers were scrubbed, mirrors polished, and wax cauldrons filled until the air reeked of scorched honey and oil. The crystal goblets gleamed in neat rows, their edges sharp in the candlelight, awaiting the blood that would soon fill them. The chamber of breaths was aired, vents adjusted, herbs gathered, their smoke ready to choke or lull. Elias moved among these preparations, with a reverence that bordered on worship, his hands steady, his eyes alight with the calm assurance of a man who believed he had mastered the elements of life and death. He told himself that he was not merely ending lives. He was distilling truths, weighing the value of blood, air, fire, and reflection against one another. Each child became an offering to a different element, their deaths not chaotic but ordered, their suffering not incidental but essential. The first victim was lowered into wax. A boy of 9, chosen for his resilience, bound to a chair as molten layers were poured over his skin. His cries filled the chamber at first, sharp and human, but as the wax stiffened, they became muffled groans trapped beneath a hardening mask. His eyes bulged, lips frozen in half-formed terror until breath could no longer escape. Elias watched closely, noting the way heat scorched flesh beneath, the blisters forming even as the wax cooled into a hardened cast. He recorded the minutes until silence, the cracks that split across the boy's skin, the way his features warped into grotesque permanence. To Elias, it was a success. The wax had preserved not only form, but fear itself. In the adjoining room, another child was drained, a girl of delicate frame strapped to the carved oak chair where grooves channeled her blood into waiting crystal. Elias incised her veins with geometric precision, the blood flowing in neat streams down carved lines, filling goblets that shimmered with dark life. She moaned faintly at first, her eyes rolling as color drained from her cheeks, but Elias hushed her gently as if coaxing her into stillness. Drop by drop, her life emptied into the glass, her body sagging against the bindings until only shallow gasps remained. When silence finally claimed her, Elias held the goblet to the candlelight. Fascinated by the way noble blood thickened in the flame, he compared her end to the boy sealed in wax, noting differences in time, in expression, in residue of body and soul. The third victim was locked within the chamber of breaths. A younger child whose small lungs were deemed ideal for studying suffocation. Elias placed him upon the floor, sealing the door behind, then adjusted the vents to allow only the faintest stream of air. At first the child breathed normally, unaware of what was to come, but soon his breaths grew sharp, shallow, desperate. Smoke of herbs was released, burning his throat, making his eyes water as he clawed at the unseen air. The struggle grew violent, then weak, until he collapsed upon the cold stone, chest heaving until it stilled. Elias opened the door only once. Silence had reigned for long minutes, entering not to comfort but to observe. He knelt beside the body, hand hovering over the boy's lips to feel the absence of breath, scribbling notes on the stages of suffocation, the precise point at which fight gave way to surrender. And so the ritual unfolded. 3 heirs, 3 deaths, 3 methods, wax, blood, and air. To Elias this was no tragedy but perfection. For the first time he could compare bodies side by side, measure which decayed faster, which retained purity, which carried in death the signs of what he called divine transformation. The waxen effigy, stiff and grotesque, stood upright like a statue. The drained girl lay pale and light, her veins collapsed, her blood preserved in vessels above. The suffocated boy was limp, his features softened by the gentleness of Heirs' slow theft. Elias catalogued them with cold precision, convinced that through this harvest he had elevated suffering into knowledge, ritual, into science. To the outside world, however, it was yet another streak of tragedy. The manor fell again into mourning, though its grief was strangely rehearsed. Neighbors heard of multiple deaths occurring within weeks, explanations of fever or sudden decline, the excuses too neat to be coincidence. Some whispered that the estate was cursed beyond redemption, that no prayer could cleanse its halls. Others feared that God himself had abandoned the Redmond line, punishing them with barrenness, stripping heir after heir before they could claim inheritance. Yet none dared to confront Elias, whose calm presence and medical reputation silenced suspicion. The pattern was too relentless to ignore, yet too hidden to accuse. Servants, however, saw more than they dared admit. They noticed the locked doors, the faint smell of wax and smoke, the stains of blood that clung even after scrubbing. Some heard muffled cries in the night, only to vanish quickly into silence. They carried trays past rooms where mirrors stood crowded with reflections that did not belong, where shadows seemed to linger long after the candles had been extinguished. A few whispered of fleeing, but fear bound them tighter than any chain. Those who questioned too boldly disappeared, their absence explained as dismissal. Those who remained lived in silence, as complicit witnesses to a harvest they dared not name. Elias himself grew emboldened. The harvest became not only ritual but obsession, repeated whenever new heirs were entrusted to his care. Each time he refined his methods, altering the mixture of herbs in the chamber, the temperature of the wax, the incision of veins. He recorded decay over days, watching which bodies stiffened first, which preserved longest, which appeared most pure in stillness. To him, the estate had become a theater of suffering, each death another performance in the symphony he called silence. And so the Redmond curse deepened, not by misfortune but by method, not by God but by the hands of a man who believed himself beyond judgment. Wealth remained untouched, inheritance always returned to the patriarch, while heirs fell like offerings in a harvest of silence. And though the neighbors whispered, though the staff trembled, no one saw the truth as Elias saw it. That the deaths were not chance but design, arranged with the same precision as notes in a song, each child another instrument silenced into eternity. Elias Redmond had lived long enough to see every heir stripped from the Redmond line, yet his estate remained untouched, its wealth secure, its halls preserved in unnatural stillness. With each passing year, he aged into a figure that seemed less man and more shadow, his face carved with lines of obsession, his hands trembling not from weakness but from the weight of rituals repeated too many times. But even as his body betrayed him, his methods continued. He still prepared chambers for suffocation, still heated wax to molten glow, still drained blood into crystal vessels by candlelight. The children continued to vanish, their deaths explained away as misfortune, their silence preserved in the mirrors and crypt beneath the manor. Yet age brought more than frailty to Elias. It brought whispers, and whispers grew into cracks. The servants were the first to notice. They had lived too long among the silences, seen too much of the shadows cast upon the walls. They spoke in hushed tones of muffled cries that seemed to seep from within the walls themselves, faint scratching that came from locked rooms long thought empty. Some swore the portraits in the gallery no longer hung still but watched, their painted eyes shifting subtly as though souls trapped within were seeking release. The crypt was avoided at all costs, though its smell lingered even in the upper halls. The mingling of wax, damp stone, and something fouler that no brush or lime could cleanse. Fear ruled the staff, yet fear also bred murmurs, and murmurs found their way beyond the estate gates. The first true fracture came with the escape of a ward. Unlike the others, this child survived long enough to understand the pattern, long enough to hear the cries that echoed behind locked doors and glimpse the grotesque forms Elias had hidden in the crypt. One night, while Elias lay overcome with the fumes of his tinctures, the ward slipped from the manor and ran barefoot across fields to the village beyond. By dawn, trembling and fevered, the child spoke of waxen figures with half-melted faces, of goblets filled not with wine but with blood, of air stolen from lungs by sealed chambers where no prayer could be heard. The words carried terror but also conviction, and soon they reached ears Elias could not silence. The church. The investigation was quiet, cautious, and cloaked in secrecy. The church could not afford scandal, not when noble names and royal ties hovered near. But discreet envoys were sent to the estate, men of scripture and medicine alike, and what they found beneath the manor chilled even their hardened souls. Fragments of waxen effigies lay broken in the crypt, their warped faces still recognizable as children, their features twisted into eternal screams. Manuscripts stained with blood described rituals of air and fire, instructions written not in medical language but in the tongue of sacrament. Drawings of veins mapped across parchment like constellations revealed the precision with which Elias had drained his victims. It was enough to damn him in silence, though not enough to damn him in law. The findings were buried, sealed in church vaults to protect the reputation of those who had once trusted Elias. But whispers escaped like smoke through cracks. They spread across villages and towns, carried by servants who fled the estate and by envoys who could not fully keep their horror chained. Stories of waxen children and blood goblets passed from mouth to trembling mouth, twisting into legend even as Elias remained within his manor, untried, unpunished, and untouched. England itself seemed to hold its breath, torn between silencing the truth and fearing it. Elias's own end came not in triumph but in sudden collapse. Some claimed he was poisoned by his own tinctures, the alchemical mixtures he had long tested upon others finally turning against him. Others whispered that he suffocated in the chamber of breaths, trapped by his own contraptions, his lungs choked by the same smoke he had forced upon countless heirs. There were those, too, who said no natural cause could explain his death, that the mirrors he had filled with stolen souls turned upon him at last, drawing his breath into their depths until nothing of him remained but silence. However it happened, when his body was discovered, it bore no sign of struggle. Only the calm stillness he had so often forced upon others, as though the silence he worshipped had finally claimed him. His death was not mourned. The estate was shuttered, its corridors locked, its crypt sealed beneath stone. Servants fled, neighbors avoided the grounds, and even the church, though it knew the truth, spoke of him only in whispers. To some, the Redmond estate became cursed ground, a place where the dead lingered and the walls themselves remembered. To others, it was a warning best forgotten, an atrocity swallowed by time for fear of what it revealed about the fragility of innocence and the cruelty that could hide behind respectability. And so the quiet collapse came not with exposure or trial, but with silence. The same silence Elias had mastered, the same silence he had woven into the deaths of countless heirs. His legacy was not written in inheritance, but in absence, not in noble bloodlines, but in hollow graves and whispers that spread across England like a chill that would never lift. The Redmond curse was sealed, not by chance or fate, but by the deliberate hand of a man who had perfected suffering into ritual and believed himself untouchable until silence consumed him too. When Elias Redmond's body was lowered into the earth, the silence that followed was unlike any that had come before. It was not the silence of a family in mourning, nor the silence of heirs stolen from their futures. It was the silence of a community that knew the truth but dared not speak it aloud. The estate was shuttered, its windows darkened, its crypt sealed beneath stone. The fields grew wild, the gardens untended, and the manor itself stood as a husk, a monument to wealth preserved at the cost of innocence. But the horrors that had thrived in its chambers did not remain buried. They lingered in whispers, shaping law, rumor, and memory long after the man himself had vanished. The first consequence came quietly, through the crown itself. Under Charles II, laws on guardianship of noble children were tightened. No longer could a single patriarch hold unchallenged authority over wards and heirs. Physicians were required to keep transparent records of treatments, signatures were demanded for diagnoses, and new oversight was imposed on private studies where science might blur into secrecy. These reforms were never publicly tied to Redmond, for to expose his crimes would have been to stain the names of those who had once trusted him. But behind the official language, everyone knew. The law was written in the shadow of the Redmond curse. Medical practice across England shifted as well. Scholars debated openly about the danger of unchecked authority among physicians. Some spoke of Elias Redmond without naming him, referring instead to a learned man who mistook cruelty for knowledge. The push for accountability grew stronger, not because of progress alone, but because the Redmond horrors had shown what could happen when science hid behind wealth, when reputation shielded a man from suspicion, when silence itself became an accomplice. The very methods Elias once boasted of, Suffocation chambers, draining blood, even wax preservation, became unspoken warnings of what medicine could devolve into when guided not by healing but by obsession. And yet, though the laws tightened and the medical field shifted, the curse endured in ways no decree could erase. The villagers near the estate built a small memorial in secret, a stone cross carved with the words, "For the heirs who never lived to inherit." No names were inscribed, for names were dangerous. To write them would have been to admit the truth aloud. And so the memorial remained faceless, like the children it sought to remember, a silent mark of grief standing against the wind. Travelers who stumbled upon it whispered that flowers were always left there, though no one ever saw who placed them. Art and rumor carried the curse into other forms. Painters depicted pale children in white gowns seated before mirrors, their reflections blurred, their faces too perfect in stillness. Writers hinted at noble families ruined by tragedies too orderly to be chance. Tales of waxen figures hidden in crypts spread across the countryside, merging with older superstitions until the Redmond estate was spoken of as a haunted ground where children's voices still cried within the walls. The truth had been buried by the church, but legend refused to be silenced. What Elias had done became larger than one man. It became a story that people told to warn one another of the dangers hidden behind respectability. And in that retelling lay the most unsettling legacy of all. For though Elias Redmond had been singular in his cruelty, his story revealed a truth no one wished to confront, that evil thrives not only in violence but in silence. He had lived decades as a man of honor, a physician, a scholar welcomed in courts and admired by nobles. No one questioned because no one wanted to believe. His victims were too small to speak for themselves, and those who suspected found their voices drowned by fear or dismissed as hysteria. The world had not failed to see. It had chosen not to look. In the centuries that followed, the Redmond curse remained less a tale of ghosts than a mirror held up to society. It asked the same question in every retelling. How many families buried their heirs beneath the mask of respectability? How many names of physicians, nobles, or men of learning were never stained because silence protected them? How many other houses echoed with cries that no one dared acknowledge until history swallowed them whole? The horror of Elias Redmond was not only in what he did, but in how easily he was allowed to do it. Today the estate stands in ruin, its corridors locked, its crypt sealed, its gardens reclaimed by weeds. But those who wander too near still claim the air feels heavy, that mirrors found in the rubble fog without breath, that the faint smell of wax and smoke clings to the stones. Some dismiss it as imagination, others as curse, but the truth is simpler and darker. Evil leaves marks. It lingers not only in legend, but in the way a society remembers and forgets, in the laws written to prevent repetition, in the silence carried forward by those too afraid to speak. And so the faceless story closes not with Elias Redmond himself, but with the world that allowed him. His name fades into whispers, his estate into ruin, his victims into faceless memorials. But his legacy remains, buried in the marrow of history, a reminder that behind titles, wealth, and the mask of science, the most methodical cruelty can thrive unseen. The haunting question is not whether Elias was unique, but whether he was alone. And it is left for us centuries later to ask what few dared to in his own time. Could such evil hidden in plain sight rise again?